Some political parties yesterday said that the president was not consulting with them or any one of them regarding plans surrounding COVID-19. So the question we ask is, what role should Parliament be playing in the COVID-19 response? To unpack this, as well as a whole lot more, I'm joined now by Dr. Zwelinzima Mandevu from the Stellenbosch University School of Public Leadership. Dr. Ndevu, thank you so much for your time today. So the question is, should the president be consulting with opposition parties on his strategy moving forward in the fight against COVID-19?
Thank you very much for having me, and good afternoon to your listeners. We should remember that we are in the state of disaster. And in terms of the Disaster Management Act, the highest decision making in dealing with issues of this nature would then be the National Disaster Management Center and the Corona Coordinating Council, as led by Nkosazana Zuma. But as a courtesy, the president is allowed to consult with opposition parties and other stakeholders. But it is not something that is, in terms of the state of disaster, something that he should be doing. It is something that he does as a courtesy.
What we saw yesterday after the president's media briefing is some political parties saying that they really ought to be consulted, feeling that they have been left on the curb. Some of the issues that were highlighted is the lack of transparency as well as the irregularities in PPE procurement, already then putting a dent on government's response to COVID-19. Considering the state of disaster that we're in now, how then does Parliament continue to play its oversight role?
We must remember that while we have the National Coronavirus Council, it is part of the executive. It is an extension of the executive, which is one wing of government. The executive is normally accountable to the legislature, which is Parliament. So decisions that have to do with the resources and how resources are going to be spent, I assume would then go to the relevant parliamentary committees for ratification. And that's where transparency would be seen. When we procure this vaccine, the expectation is that we should be told the numbers, we should be told the nuts and bolts on how to arrive and what would be the cost of procuring those vaccines. What the president has done previously was to consult with opposition parties' leaders as a courtesy, those that are represented in parliament. And the expectation was that he continues with that.
There are certain non-disclosure clauses that exist between government and the suppliers of the vaccine. In a case as dire as this, which really is a case of life and death, should some of these provisions that exist between government and the providers of the vaccine not be made public, because they will at the end be of public concern?
I think things that are of public interest would be made public, but we should appreciate that in any procurement of this nature or in any business deal, there are certain things that are concealed, but they should not be concealed with the objective or with the aim in mind to conceal information. It is just to not give certain detailed compromises that have arrived at that would compromise either of the parties going forward, but it should not be concealing information or anything. So I assume that once decisions have been taken, deals have been made, information would come out in the open. It is because of the negotiations that there are these confidentiality clauses that are in place, because we must remember that there are trade-offs that have been made currently, and those would foster these disclosure clause, non-disclosure clause.
I'm quite interested, Doctor, for us to interrogate the state of national disaster. It is an extended state. We're still in the midst of the pandemic. How long does this definition actually last for? And could one not argue that perhaps the initial stages of COVID-19 ought then to have been defined and classified as a state of disaster? But because it's such a prolonged period, there is more calm, there is a greater time to reflect and put plans in place. Is this not a time to perhaps start loosening the reins a bit so that Parliament can actually continue playing its oversight role and that political parties also have a say in the way that the country moves forward? Just your thoughts on that.
I think you are correct that a prolonged state of disaster might also compromise accountability and in some senses integrity of processes and transparency, because by nature, a state of disaster forces government to take decisions quickly, and by so doing, it limits time for consultation. But when it's prolonged like it is currently, then you have serious challenges. But also, at the same token, we must also appreciate that the effect that of this disease is that we are dealing with a pandemic that is not really controllable unless you put measures in place and expect members of the community to also assist in that process. And as a result of that, the state of disaster has to be promulgated every 30 days. So every 30 days, that has to be renewed. So for this period, it ends on the 15th of January, and the president has already indicated that they will continue with it until the 15th of February. So you assess as you go along as to whether there is a need for you to venture into this kind of approach in dealing with the disaster. We have never dealt with a disaster of this nature, and I think there are lessons to be learned here too.
Bearing in mind the issues of governance and strategy and processes, how would you perhaps advise political parties and Parliament to move forward in regard to the national state of disaster, considering the fact that they feel that they want to be part of the process moving forward? Could they perhaps advocate for some sort of an amended state of disaster?
I think what they should be doing, if I was part of any opposition political party or any political party represented in Parliament, what I would do, our structures would be involved at the lowest level in the disaster structures or centers that are at district level, are at provincial level, but also ensure that parliamentary committees sit virtually, as we have seen previously doing that. So I would assume that the parliamentary committee on COCTA would then sit and invite the minister who chairs the National Coronavirus Council to then report. And that's where you would be holding the minister and the executive accountable in terms of their actions. So I would advocate that we don't only look at the central role, but we also look at the local role of these structures, so that where the information filters down from the local structures to the upper structures. And that's where political parties might make a bigger impact in terms of influencing decisions and processes.
What impact does the seeming lack of influence that opposition parties in Parliament have regarding the way forward, what impact does that have on South Africans and their sense that their voices have been heard and that their votes actually count when it matters?
I think the unfortunate part, and we are seeing the effects of that, is that we don't hear a single voice. We don't hear a single message from all public representatives, irrespective of their political parties. When we started last year in March with this lockdown and in dealing with the pandemic, there was a singular voice that was out there because there was proper consultation with different stakeholders. They were on board, all of them. So some feel left out, and as a result, they are suspicious of the process that's being followed. And that's the danger of really not consulting, even if it's outside of the law. So if you consult people, they trust the process more. They trust the people that are in charge of the system more. And that helps in dealing with the challenge of this nature, which needs everybody to have their hands on deck.
Do the various political parties have the will to unite and be able to speak in one voice with issues such as this?
I think they have demonstrated that in 2020 when we dealt firstly with this coronavirus, where the presidents consulted them. Out of the consultation process, there was a buy-in in terms of what approach government is taking in dealing with this virus. And I think in crisis of this nature, we really want to see that. We want to see the unity in dealing with this. And that's the only way you can win a pandemic of this nature, when there's unity, when all stakeholders, irrespective of their political persuasion, are speaking in one voice. And with this pandemic knows no political affiliation. So it affects all political parties in the same manner. So we need a singular voice in that sense.
Dr. Ndevu, thank you so much for your insights this afternoon. Certainly, I think a conversation that many of the political parties in Parliament would gain from as to a way forward if they're feeling underrepresented, if they're feeling that they don't have a voice and want to be part of the solutions moving forward in regard to COVID-19.